So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar where Ian Smith and I will discuss the preferred research agenda and how we came up with the methods that we were going to use and the research questions in this particular case study across the case studies. Just a quick disclosure, what we say today are our views and not those of anybody, institution, or organization that we're affiliated with. And Ian, if you could admit people, I keep seeing an alert that there are people that are popping into the waiting room.
I think Carl's also jumping on that too.
Okay, so here's an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about prefer and the background. And then again, the needs assessment, the methods assessment, and the research questions, and how we very intentionally went through those steps to arrive at the preferred research agenda. So prefer background. There are a lot of open questions in patient preference research. And patient preference research has been around for a long time. However, when applying it to healthcare, the level of rigor and the different standards that we apply are undergoing more scrutiny in this space. So there's a lot that we know about preferences, but there's a lot that we would like to know more about. For prefer, the project goals are to establish recommendations to support guidelines for industry, regulatory authorities, and HTA bodies on how and when to include patient preferences on benefits and risks of medicines throughout the life cycle. Again, when do you use preferences in the health setting, and what are the requirements for doing so? So this diagram shows the 3 steps for prefer, and where we are today is in step 3. We're rounding out the case studies and writing up those reports and developing recommendations from them. But what we're going to talk to you today is about the early phases in step 1. In order to carry out the project, you need to have a strong basis for the direction that you're heading, and we're going to outline that today. So first, the needs assessment. We talked to a lot of stakeholders and conducted some scoping literature reviews. Sorry, I forgot about all these builds here. We did an extensive literature review and then qualitative interviews to get the lay of the land. And this included identifying needs and concerns about stakeholders for preference studies. What did they need? What were their concerns? Identify the decision points when you would use a preference study, and then situations or factors that would influence the value of the preference studies. This was an extensive body of work and has resulted in the publications that you see in the bottom. But briefly, this was used to lay the groundwork for where the priorities lied and the needs lied by talking to stakeholders and looking at the literature review, including some focus groups. And we try to include everyone here, as you'll see: patients, caregivers, industry, regulator and HTA, academics, physicians. We wanted to collectively take all stakeholder feedback as a starting point. So, sorry about this. So taking all of this together, there were some themes that emerged, and Ian's going to talk a little bit about how we took these themes and turned it into the research agenda. That the big concern is, what is what I'm calling your evidentiary standard? How robust are these? Are they repeatable? How robust is the design? How do I know that I can trust the results? So there's a lot of discussion about robust methods and robust sampling and the evidence standard when you're going to use it in the healthcare setting. There was also the realization that preferences could be heterogeneous. Not everybody values the same thing. So people brought up the need to make sure that we assess preference heterogeneity. The other big one in preference studies, because of the you're asking the patient questions is to make sure that you minimize the burden and you don't give them too onerous a task or too many tasks. And then the final thing is, because preference studies can involve complex concepts or mathematics and weighing trade-offs, you want to make sure that patients understand. One of the historic concerns has been, are we burdening the patient and do they understand what we're trying to ask? So make sure that we maximize the opportunity for success with regard to patients' understanding and not overburdening. So what methods are we going to use now that we know what the needs are and what people want to know about? How do we pick the methods that Prefer is going to study and map to the case studies? So this is again brief here. There is a paper on this. We looked at the preference research methods out there based on the literature reviews and the stakeholder needs and the different methods that had been identified. And we conducted a preference study to see what people valued in preference studies. And very briefly, we just wanted to identify which methods, therefore, performed best based on these criteria and should be brought forth in the case studies. So how do we judge a preference method? As shown in this particular slide, you could judge it by how much it costs, by the patient burden, by whether or not you can be flexible with the design and so forth. And so you see the criteria that we included in the evaluation is on the left. And we thought that it might vary based on whether or not you are conducting a preference study for early development or maybe in post-marketing. So we took these criteria and had people that were responding weight the value and the importance of this criteria. So again, the same themes emerged in some of the qualitative interviews and the lit reviews, is that methods that can demonstrate heterogeneity, if it's there, are important. And again, this idea of this evidentiary standard, is it reliable? Is it valid? And clearly, people really care about patient burden and making sure that it's not too onerous an exercise. There was also a taxonomy done of the qualitative and quantitative methods as part of Prefer. And we were able to take the results of the study I just showed you and apply the criteria about what people valued in a preference study. And the qualitative methods that are shown here, in order to decide which ones might be applied to Prefer, the evaluation was considered. So in this case, these three methods were considered the most promising for qualitative methods based on what people expressed that they valued and needed. And these were encouraged to be considered in the case studies. This taxonomy that has been published also went through quantitative methods. And as you can see, there are different ways of ranking and rating, and these methods are a little bit different in their frame. So they're shown here. And again, when you take the study and what people value in preference studies, we had to pick the most promising methods to study. So here is the original list. And then the ones that are still shown in black are those that were considered more promising and therefore going to be part of the ones that might be considered for the case studies. The other thing that was discussed is whether or not to use certain methods in every case study or use different methods. And the discrete choice experiment is a little bit farther along in terms of the extent to which it's been studied. And there are a lot of advantages to considering that in the research question. And it has the highest probability to answer methodological questions around trade-offs, maximum acceptable risk, heterogeneity, and so forth. And so it was felt by Prefer that it should be included where possible. So next, we're going to talk about the research questions for the case study. So I just showed you the literature review and the interviews and the themes that emerged from that. And I just showed you the methods assessment, the taxonomy, and then how we narrowed down based on the preference study, which methods we might use. But putting it all together, we have to map these to the questions for the case study. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian Smith of Utrecht to continue that discussion.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ian Smith, and I'm a PhD researcher at the University Medical Center in Utrecht. And I'm going to tell how we transitioned from discussing with stakeholders and analyzing different methods to converting this into research questions that we could kind of operationalize and use to guide the research designs of case studies. So Rachael already described how we've interviewed stakeholders and we did a very large literature review to identify research needs. And we use this also to generate a methods assessment to identify which methods are most promising in terms of what should be used when measuring patient preferences. But now we wanted to develop research questions because a large part of Prefer was also generating new evidence to help answer these questions. And of course, when you have these case studies, you need research questions to build and to design around. So what happened was during this whole process, we'd also been generating a list of questions. And based on the interviews and based on the literature reviews, we came up with just over 100 questions of interest. And these were all unique. So this is after narrowing things down and kind of compiling different questions into unique questions. And what we found was that while there were 100 questions of interest, not all of the questions were relevant to planning a case study. And this could be that they were relevant to the entire world of patient preferences. So how do different stakeholders interpret patient preferences, or how can these preferences be used in clinical care? But this wasn't something that you would really design a case study around. That would be more a post-case study. You would say, okay, now we have some evidence. How can this be interpreted in a practical setting? So those really couldn't be used for guiding these preferences. So what we did, or guiding the case study design. So what we did was we categorized these different questions into different tiers. And now we had a 3-tier system. And the primary tier were questions that we recognized as being useful to guiding the design of case study that could be answered within a case study and that hadn't really been answered in other places. So these were questions that we felt and that other stakeholders felt really needed more evidence to help to understand, because these are clearly important questions. People were bringing them up, but there just wasn't enough evidence out there really currently to guide our recommendations. Now, the secondary tier was similar to the primary tier, and that these were questions that were relevant to the case study design and to planning a case study, but we kind of felt that there was enough evidence out there, or there was enough pre-existing evidence that they didn't need to be really looked at in our setting, that there was enough evidence out there that something could have been done based on historical case studies or just another kind of systematic review or something along those lines. So we didn't need to design new case studies to address them. And the tertiary tier was questions that simply we weren't answerable in a case study. And these were questions, I'm gonna move from our list. Yeah, again, what I said, like what conditions would patient preference assessment be useful for clinical care, or what different factors would influence their usefulness to HTA stakeholders. So questions like that you wouldn't necessarily design a case study to answer. You could answer those through simulation studies or through discussions with different stakeholders to generate that. So still 27 questions is a lot. And I think a big part of Prefer, and especially with having all these case studies, was not to generate one study looking at these, but really to build a solid body of evidence to help guide these recommendations. So we sat down and we said 27 questions is still too many. And also not all of these questions might be as high priority as others. So we went through a ranking exercise in which we asked stakeholders in the Prefer project to rank their top 5 questions, just to see which generally people thought were most interesting and should be addressed in Prefer. And what happened was we came up with 17 prioritized questions. So of the 27 primary tier questions, 17 of those were prioritized. And it should be noted that after 17, there was a very clear delineation between the most prioritized questions and the least prioritized questions. So these 17 questions were ones that were frequently mentioned and that people clearly were interested about, and not just one person, but multiple parties were interested in these. Now, the categories within these prioritized questions were specifically related to the reliability and validity of patient preferences. So how trustworthy are they? Are the methods appropriate? To the generalizability and transferability of questions. So how do different samples relate to larger populations or to other populations? And in some cases, similar but different patient populations. And also, how do we educate patients? Because again, as this whole exercise took place in 2018, at that time, there was very little evidence or few publications addressing specifically educational materials prior to patient preferences. So now we have a list of 17 prioritized questions. And this is an example of, we related those back to the different stakeholder needs. It should also be noted that when we relate these back to the stakeholders, none of these were individual to one stakeholder group. There was very much a lot of overlap in these questions in terms of how people prioritize them, how people thought they were interesting or relevant. So it was very nice. This table here is more of just a general description. So an example of an industry stakeholder having a concern about a patient sample or recruitment. The research question that resulted from that was, how do results differ from when using the same method, but in different samples from the same population? So kind of like how should sampling best be done, and what are concerns around that? For regulators, if they're concerned about generalizability of results, one of our issues was, can psychosocial constructs serve as covariates? So can we use other factors, other psychosocial constructs that to help predict the patient preferences? For HTA regulators, somebody might be concerned about the study design. So the risks, what might influence patient preference researchers. And so one of our big questions was, when designing a question, which preference method to develop, because as Rachel's already said, we didn't come up with one promising method. We identified multiple promising methods, and often they addressed similar conceptual types of preferences. Sometimes they were different. And one of our big questions also related to patient burden was, are simpler methods, which might present less burden to patients, how do those compare to more complex or more in-depth or expensive methods? So this was one of those questions that then overlapped across different areas of concern. And again, another stakeholder group would be patients. So, and one of the big things we hear from patients is the lack of patient knowledge and education surrounding patient preferences and how to properly educate patients. And this is, again, a perfect example of what type of educational material results has the impact on patient preferences and might be result in more reliable patient preferences. So these are just a couple of the questions. This is 4 of the 17. The entire list is at the end of the presentation if you would like to read them. But this is just a short example of how we kind of move from stakeholder concerns to research questions and how they relate to each other and this whole process coming together. Now we have this list of research questions. And of course, we wanted to generate evidence because this is generating a research question is only the first step. So within Prefer, we had a set of 12 case studies planned. We had 3 core case studies specific to the fields of rheumatoid arthritis, neuromuscular diseases, and non-small cell lung cancer. But then on top of this, we also had 4 industry-led case studies and 5 academic case studies, or academic-led case studies. It should be noted here that this is very much a public-private partnership. So while we might say industry-led, this does not mean industry done. This was very much, all of this was collaboration between different parties. And often what we mean by industry-led is just that an industry members took the lead and kind of set up the research questions and design. And we all work together, academics, industries, and regulators to kind of help develop these case studies. In addition to the actual case studies, or to the new case studies, we also looked at historic case studies. So we looked at previously generated case studies to see what evidence we could find in studies that had already been done, because there's a wealth of knowledge out there, but it needs to be extracted and put to be used in our recommendations. So we collected a large sample of historical case studies, and we conducted simulation studies to see what questions could be answered using simulations. So again, going back to the question of can any of these research questions be answered in a case study? If the answer was no, then they were potentially of interest for the simulation studies. So this is what Preferred kind of is and what the foundation of the recommendations will be. In terms of the actual case studies that we conducted, the new case studies, each preferred case study was asked to address a preference-sensitive situation that had been previously identified by a stakeholder as being of interest or an area that they wanted more research on. Every case study was asked to also include a discrete choice experiment if it was feasible. And there was one case where a research question, so the clinical research question, I said it's not reasonable to ask this question based on using a DCE. The type of evidence that would be generated using a DCE wouldn't help us with our clinical question, so we're not going to use it in this case. So, but that was one example. But all the other case studies did use a discrete choice experiment. And then also to address other methodological questions that were felt to be prioritized in prefer. So, and these were again related to the reliability and validity, generalizability and transferability, and educational materials. So we ended up with 12 case studies. And in terms of the methods used, you can see that 11 of the 12 used discrete choice experiments or best for scaling type 3. And then we had a lot of overlap too, that a lot of case studies used multiple different methods to address different preference assessment. And I think that's very strong because this type of multi-preference elicitation method research isn't conducted as frequently as I think it should be. So that's the list of the methods used. You can also see at the bottom there were clearly 4 instances of methods that we had identified as being promising, but that just people didn't agree with, so that they weren't included or used in this in any of the preferred case studies. But with only 12 case studies, it's not shocking to see that some methods weren't used. In terms of the prioritized research questions, 10 of the 17 were addressed. I think that's actually very good. And I'm actually really excited about the fact that there was a lot of overlap of these questions. So we're not just generating one research, one case study which addresses one question, and that's the one set of evidence. We're generating a lot of evidence to address these questions in many different situations. And I think that's a really big strength of this process, is that by narrowing it down the preferred research agenda into highly focused research questions, we're really able to generate a solid body of evidence around these research questions to really help add to the recommendations and kind of generate new knowledge that's very strong and supported. So, but you can see that the most, the highest number of studies or questions, sorry, the question that was used in the greatest number of studies was the question of psychosocial constructs and how they explain preference heterogeneity. And one of the aspects that we had under there was actually we asked a lot of case studies to include measures of health literacy and health numeracy, because we think those are two psychosocial constructs that are really very strong in terms of there's a lot of evidence out there showing that these should be measured more often in terms of the way that they can really help to understand patient preferences. So this is how what we did. This is how the case studies were organized and how the research questions were designed to address them. But of course, this is, again, only a start. We only were able to answer 10 of the 17 research questions. So there's still a large opportunity out there to address more of these research questions or to generate more evidence around the current research questions. And that's where we're kind of also discussing, okay, this is is just a start, but more evidence is always needed. And especially when you think about how diverse patient populations are, how diverse different treatments are, how big the medical product lifecycle is, and how these different questions and preference elicitation methods might be have different outcomes based on when they're used in the whole product lifecycle. There's still a lot of evidence that should be generated and can be generated based on these questions. So this is basically how the preferred research agenda was built and developed, and how it kind of led to the current research body of evidence that we're using to formulate recommendations. Thank you.